You killed him, Phala. You killed our father with your greed, and now you want to steal from his grave too." Those were the words my brother Anthony screamed at me across our father's coffin in front of 200 mourners who had come to pay their final respects to Samuel Anderson. Words so venomous, so calculated in their cruelty, that they echoed through the Triumph Community Church like a gunshot, silencing every conversation, stopping every tear, and turning every head toward the spectacle of two siblings destroying each other on the most sacred day of their lives. There are things a daughter should never have to hear from her own brother on the day of their father's funeral, but I heard them. And now, at 71 years old, with 5 years of sleepless nights behind me, I finally found the courage to tell you what really happened that day, and in all the years leading up to it that destroyed our family forever. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ophelia Anderson Miller, but most folks around here have always called me Miss Phala. I was born on April 15, 1953, in a small Kentucky town called Triumph, where the spring heat could crack the ground by May, and everyone knew everyone else's business going back to their great-grandparents' time. It was the kind of place where secrets were harder to keep than chickens in a henhouse, and where your reputation followed you from cradle to grave. Our family was always simple, but united, or at least that's what I believed until recently. My father, Samuel Anderson, was a man carved from the same oak trees that dotted our family's modest farmland. He was one of those souls who woke before the rooster's first crow to tend to the animals and the crops, and who only returned to the house when the last star had taken its place in the Kentucky sky. His hands were permanently stained with honest dirt and calloused from decades of hard work, but his heart, Lord, his heart was as soft as melted butter on a summer day. He never once raised his voice in anger at any of his children, never lifted a hand against us, and always believed that every problem could be solved through patient conversation and understanding. My mother, Constance Marie Anderson, was a fortress of strength disguised as a gentle woman. She was the kind of person who could carry the weight of the world on her shoulders while humming hymns and making it look effortless. She cooked meals for a family of 7, as if feeding angels was her divine calling, washed clothes every day of the week without complaint, and sewed late into the night by lamplight to earn the few extra dollars that kept us comfortable. But no matter how busy her days became, Mama always found time to sit with us children in the early evenings, telling us stories passed down through generations, teaching us prayers that had been whispered in our family for over a century, and dispensing the kind of wisdom that could only come from a mother's heart. We were 5 children in total, born over the span of 8 years. I was the second oldest, wedged between my brother Anthony, who arrived 2 years before me in 1951, and my 3 younger siblings, Mary, born in 1955, John in 1957, and little Peter, our baby, who came along in 1959. Anthony was always different from the rest of us, and I mean that in ways that took me decades to fully understand. Even as a small child, there was something restless in him, something angry that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface without any clear cause or reason. While Mary, John, Peter, and I played together, shared our toys, and found joy in the simple pleasures of childhood, Anthony always seemed to be keeping score of some invisible game where he was perpetually losing. I remember one particular incident when I was about 8 years old. Anthony would have been 10, that perfectly illustrated what I'm talking about. Mama had walked 3 miles to the general store in town and returned with a small paper bag of peppermint candies, the kind with red and white stripes that cost 5 cents apiece. It was a rare treat for our family, as money for such luxuries was scarce. Mama carefully counted out 5 pieces, 1 for each of us children, making sure they were exactly equal in size and weight. But before any of us could even unwrap our candy, Anthony started crying. Not the natural tears of a hurt child, but the calculated sobs of someone who had learned that tears could be weapons. He claimed his piece was smaller than mine, that Mama always gave me more of everything, that he was the forgotten child whom nobody loved. The accusation was so patently false that it left the rest of us speechless. But Mama, with that infinite well of patience that seemed to define her, took both his candy and mine, broke them into smaller pieces, redistributed them, and let Anthony choose first from the pile. Even after this gesture of fairness, Anthony remained sullen and resentful for the rest of the day, as if the very act of having to share equally was somehow an injustice committed against him personally. This pattern repeated itself constantly throughout our childhood. If Daddy brought home fruit from a neighbor's orchard, Anthony would complain that his apple was more bruised than everyone else's. If Mama gave hugs at bedtime, he would time them with the precision of a railroad conductor, certain that his embrace was shorter than those given to his siblings. If a neighbor complimented one of us children on our behavior or appearance, Anthony would inevitably find a way to turn it into evidence of his own neglect. The most heartbreaking part was how our parents responded to this constant dissatisfaction. Instead of recognizing it as the manipulative behavior it was, they bent over backwards to accommodate Anthony's complaints. They gave him extra attention, additional privileges, and special consideration, always hoping that the next gesture of love would finally fill whatever empty space seemed to exist inside their eldest son. But it never worked. The more they gave, the more he demanded. The more they sacrificed for his happiness, the more convinced he became that he deserved even greater sacrifices. When Anthony reached adolescence, the situation deteriorated dramatically. At 13, he began questioning every decision our parents made, not with the natural curiosity of a growing mind, but with the harsh criticism of someone who believed himself inherently superior to those around him. If Daddy purchased a new tool for the farm, Anthony would announce that he could have chosen a better one. If Mama prepared our family's traditional Sunday dinner, he would complain that it was too bland, too simple, not as good as what other families in town were eating. I tried repeatedly to defend our parents during these episodes, attempting to explain to Anthony that they were doing their best with limited resources, that raising 5 children on a farmer's income required difficult choices and constant sacrifice. But he would look at me with eyes full of contempt and dismissal, telling me I was naive, that I didn't understand anything about the real world, and that someday I would discover what our parents were really like beneath their facade of goodness. These conversations left me deeply unsettled, not because I doubted our parents' love, but because I couldn't understand how my brother could be so blind to the obvious truth of their devotion. How could he not see Daddy's exhaustion after 16-hour days in the fields? How could he not notice Mama's worn hands from endless hours of labor, or the way she mended our clothes by candlelight to save money on electricity? When I turned 15 and Anthony was 17, he got his first job at Morrison's auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. The work was dirty and demanding, changing oil, fixing flat tires, cleaning engine parts, but it was honest employment that paid him $12 a week. For most young men in our community, this would have been a source of pride, a step toward adult responsibility and independence. For Anthony, it became another weapon in his ongoing war against our family. The moment he started earning his own money, Anthony's attitude toward the rest of us changed completely. He began acting as if his weekly paycheck made him superior to those of us who still depended on our parents for support. He would make snide comments about being the only one in the family with a real job, as if Daddy's backbreaking work on the farm somehow didn't count as legitimate employment. The breaking point came on a sweltering Saturday afternoon in July. Daddy had spent the morning repairing a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent storm, and he asked Anthony to help him finish the job before the day got too hot. It was the kind of family cooperation that had always been standard in our household. Everyone pitched in when work needed to be done, regardless of age or gender. But Anthony exploded with a fury I had never witnessed before. "I'm not a child anymore!" He screamed, his voice cracking with adolescent rage. "I work outside this house. Now I earn my own money. I don't have any obligation to do your slave labor anymore." The word slave hung in the air like a slap. Daddy stood there, hammer in hand, looking as if his own son had struck him across the face. He was a man who had never asked for anything from his children except respect and basic cooperation. And now, he was being accused of exploitation by the boy he had raised with nothing but love. But if Daddy was too shocked to respond, Mama was not. She rose from her rocking chair on the front porch, where she had been mending one of Peter's shirts, and approached Anthony with a determination I had rarely seen in her gentle demeanor. "Slave work?" she said, her voice trembling with controlled anger. "This house that you call slave work is where you eat 3 meals a day without paying a penny. It's where you sleep in a warm bed every night without contributing to the rent. It's where you've been clothed and cared for and loved for 17 years without being asked for anything in return except basic human decency. If you think you're so grown and independent, you can pack your things and go find somewhere else to live." Anthony's face turned crimson, but for once in his life, he seemed to have no comeback. He stood there for a long moment, fists clenched, jaw working, as if he were chewing words too bitter to swallow. Finally, he stormed into the house, and we could hear him banging around in his room, throwing things into a canvas bag. 20 minutes later, he emerged with his belongings and stalked down our dirt driveway without looking back. His parting words shouted over his shoulder were, "One day you'll all miss me. One day you'll realize what you lost." He stayed away for 3 days. 3 days during which Daddy paced the floors and stared down the road, hoping to see his eldest son returning home. 3 days during which Mama cooked Anthony's favorite meals and left them covered on the stove just in case. 3 days during which the rest of us children walked on eggshells, afraid that our family was truly breaking apart. When Anthony finally did return, it was just before supper time on Wednesday evening. He walked through the front door as if nothing had happened, sat down at his usual place at the table, and began eating without a word of apology or explanation. We all sat there in awkward silence, afraid to say anything that might provoke another explosion. But something fundamental had changed in Anthony during those 3 days. The distance between him and the rest of the family became more pronounced, more deliberate. He ate his meals in silence, left for work without saying goodbye, came home, and went straight to his bedroom. When he did speak, it was with a coldness that felt calculated to hurt, as if he were testing how much damage he could inflict with words alone. I tried desperately to bridge the growing gap between us. Anthony and I had once been close despite our differences. We had shared a bedroom until I was 12, whispered secrets after our parents thought we were asleep, created elaborate games that could entertain us for hours. I remembered the brother who had taught me to skip stones on Miller's Pond, who had defended me when older children teased me at school, who had once walked 3 miles to town just to buy me a ribbon for my hair with money he had earned doing chores for neighbors. But that Anthony seemed to have vanished completely. When I attempted to start conversations, he would look at me as if I were a stranger whose presence annoyed him. When I asked about his work or his plans for the future, he would respond with monosyllables or sarcasm. Most painfully, when I tried to reminisce about our shared childhood memories, he would dismiss them as if they had happened to someone else entirely. "You don't understand anything about life, fella," he would say whenever I attempted to reach out to him. "You're still a child living in a fantasy world. When you grow up and see how cruel reality is, maybe then we can have a real conversation." These words stung because they were so unfair. At 15, I was already helping Mama with most of the household management. I cooked meals, cleaned the house, did laundry, and took care of my younger siblings when our parents needed to work late. I had never asked for anything beyond basic necessities, had never complained about our modest circumstances, had never demanded special treatment or privileges. If anyone in our family was living in a fantasy world, it certainly wasn't me. When I turned 18 in 1971, Anthony was 20 and had moved out of our family home permanently. He rented a small room above Henderson's Five and Dime in downtown Triumph, claiming he needed independence and couldn't stand living in a house full of people anymore. Daddy was heartbroken by this development, though he tried to hide his feelings behind philosophical acceptance. Every bird has its time to leave the nest, he said the day Anthony moved his belongings out of our house. I just hope he doesn't forget where home is when he needs it. But Anthony not only forgot where home was, he began actively disparaging it to anyone who would listen. Word traveled back to us through neighbors and acquaintances that he was telling people our family was backwards, old-fashioned, and ignorant. According to the stories that reached our ears, Anthony painted our parents as controlling and narrow-minded, our household as oppressive and suffocating, and himself as a victim of small-town mentality who had finally broken free from his limitations. These reports hurt Mama more deeply than she ever let on. I would sometimes find her sitting quietly on the front porch in the evenings, staring into the distance with an expression of profound sadness. Once I overheard her talking to Daddy in their bedroom, her voice heavy with maternal anguish. What did I do wrong with that boy Samuel? Did I love him too much? Not enough? Was I too strict or not strict enough? Daddy's response was always the same. You were a perfect mother, Constance. Anthony chose to be the way he is. That's not your fault or your failure. But I could see that both of them carried a burden of guilt, that they didn't deserve a pain that came from loving someone who seemed determined to reject that love at every opportunity. Anthony's visits home became increasingly rare and increasingly unpleasant. He would show up for Christmas or Daddy's birthday, always arriving late and leaving early, always finding something to criticize or complain about. During Daddy's 50th birthday celebration in 1972, Anthony spent the entire evening making disparaging comments about the food Mama had spent days preparing, the decorations Mary and I had hung, and the primitive way our family celebrated special occasions. This is exactly the kind of thing I had to escape, he announced to the room full of relatives and neighbors who had come to honor Daddy. Small-town people with small-town minds playing at sophistication, they don't understand. The silence that followed this pronouncement was deafening. I watched Daddy's face crumple with embarrassment and hurt, saw Mama quickly excuse herself to the kitchen where she could cry in private. Our guests, most of whom had known Anthony since birth, looked uncomfortable and confused. This was not the polite, well-raised young man they remembered from his childhood. That night, after everyone had gone home and the dishes were washed and put away, I made a decision that would define the rest of my relationship with Anthony. I would no longer stand by silently while he hurt our parents. I would no longer tolerate his disrespect and cruelty in the name of family harmony. If he wanted to be hateful, he would have to face opposition. The next time Anthony made one of his cutting remarks, I was ready for him. It was Easter Sunday, 1973, and he had arrived at our family dinner with his usual air of superiority and disdain. When Mama brought out the traditional ham she had been preparing since dawn, Anthony looked at it with theatrical disgust. "Is this really the best we can do?" he asked loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. "I've been eating in restaurants in Lexington, and this looks like something they'd throw away." That was my breaking point. I stood up from my chair, looked him directly in the eyes, and spoke with a clarity and firmness that surprised even me. "Anthony, that ham represents hours of work by a woman who loves you despite the fact that you don't deserve it. If our family's cooking isn't good enough for your sophisticated palate, you're welcome to leave and find a restaurant that meets your standards, but you will not sit at our table and insult the people who raised you." Anthony's response revealed the depth of his resentment toward me specifically. "Oh, look who's talking, the perfect daughter, the one who never did anything wrong, the one who gets all the praise and attention. You've always been their favorite fella, and you've used that position to make the rest of us feel worthless." His accusation was so shocking, so completely divorced from reality, that I genuinely didn't know how to respond. Favorite, I had never received any special treatment or privileges. If anything, I had taken on more responsibilities and received less recognition than my siblings. The idea that I had somehow manipulated our parents or sabotaged my brothers and sisters was not just false, it was insane. But Anthony's words revealed something important about his psychological state. In his mind, every act of love or kindness shown to others was somehow stolen from him. Every moment of attention paid to his siblings was evidence of a conspiracy against him. Every family success or happiness was proof of his own victimization. This warped worldview would only grow stronger and more destructive over the years that followed. In 1975, at the age of 22, I married Thomas Miller, a kind and hard-working man who shared my values and respected my family, despite Anthony's best efforts to poison him against them. Thomas had grown up on a farm similar to ours, understood the importance of family loyalty, and genuinely enjoyed spending time with my parents and siblings. He tried repeatedly to build a relationship with Anthony, inviting him to our home for meals, including him in social activities, and treating him with the respect due to a brother-in-law. Anthony's response to these overtures was predictably cold and suspicious. He seemed to view Thomas's friendliness as either stupidity or manipulation, and he made no effort to hide his contempt for what he called our simple-minded lifestyle. When Thomas and I had our first child, a daughter we named Sarah, Anthony's reaction was telling in its complete lack of enthusiasm or affection. He visited exactly once during Sarah's first year of life, staying less than an hour and spending most of that time making passive-aggressive comments about the burden of raising children and the way parenthood trapped people in mediocre lives. When our second daughter, Rebecca, was born 2 years later, Anthony didn't visit at all. My children grew up barely knowing their uncle, and when they did encounter him at family gatherings, they found him intimidating and unpleasant. "Why is Uncle Anthony always angry, Mama?" Sarah asked me after one particularly uncomfortable Christmas dinner when she was about 6 years old. "Did we do something to make him mad?" How do you explain to a child that some people carry anger like a disease, that some adults never learn to find joy or contentment no matter how much love surrounds them? I settled for telling her that Uncle Anthony had troubles in his heart that had nothing to do with her or anyone else in our family, but I could see that she didn't really understand. Neither did I, if I'm being honest. Meanwhile, our parents continued to age with the natural dignity that comes from a life well lived. Daddy's hair turned silver. His back developed a slight stoop from decades of farm work, but his spirit remained strong and generous. Mama's face showed the lines that come from years of smiling and worrying in equal measure, but her capacity for love seemed to grow rather than diminish with time. As their eldest children moved into adulthood, Mama and Daddy began to rely more heavily on those of us who remained close to home. Not because they demanded our help, but because it felt natural and right to care for the people who had sacrificed so much for us. I found myself stopping by their house several times a week, helping with heavy cleaning, driving them to medical appointments, and simply spending time in their company because I genuinely enjoyed their conversation and wisdom. Anthony interpreted this natural evolution of family relationships as evidence of some grand conspiracy. During his increasingly rare visits home, he would make comments about how I was manipulating our aging parents, positioning myself for special treatment and driving wedges between him and the rest of the family. The irony of these accusations coming from someone who had voluntarily distanced himself from his family was apparently lost on him. In 1983, our family faced its first major tragedy when Mary was killed in a car accident at the age of 28. She had been driving home from her job at the county courthouse when another driver, drunk and speeding, ran a red light and struck her car. She died instantly, leaving behind a husband, 2 small children, and a family devastated by the sudden loss of someone so young and full of life. Mary's funeral was the first time I had seen Anthony cry since he was a child. He stood at the graveside with tears streaming down his face, and for a moment I thought perhaps this tragedy would restore some humanity to him, would remind him of what truly mattered in life. During the reception after the service, he even approached me and initiated a conversation that felt almost normal. "I can't believe she's gone," he said, his voice thick with genuine grief. "Mary was always the sweetest of all of us. She never hurt anyone, never caused trouble. It should have been someone else. I agreed wholeheartedly, and for a few minutes, we shared memories of our sister's kindness and humor. I began to hope that Mary's death might serve as a wake-up call, for Anthony might help him realize how precious and fragile family bonds truly are. But within a week of the funeral, Anthony was back to his old patterns of behavior, with an additional layer of bitterness added to his existing resentments. He seemed to view Mary's death not as a reason to cherish his remaining family members, but as further evidence that life was unfair and cruel. Instead of drawing closer to those of us who were left, he became even more isolated and hostile. Worse still, he began making inquiries about Mary's estate, what property she had owned, what money she had saved, what would happen to her belongings. These questions, asked barely a month after our sister's burial, shocked and disgusted everyone who heard them. John and Peter were particularly upset by Anthony's apparent concern with financial matters so soon after our loss. "Can you believe he's already asking about Mary's money?" John said to me after one particularly insensitive conversation with Anthony. "She's barely cold in the ground, and he's doing math in his head." This incident marked the beginning of Anthony's obsession with inheritance and family assets. It was as if Mary's death had awakened some calculating part of his brain that viewed every family member as a potential source of future wealth. He began paying closer attention to our parents' health, their living arrangements, their financial situation, not out of concern for their well-being, but as a kind of morbid investment analysis. As our parents entered their 70s, their need for assistance increased naturally and gradually. Daddy developed arthritis in his hands and knees, making farm work increasingly difficult. Mama's eyesight began to deteriorate, and she struggled with tasks that required fine motor control like sewing and cooking elaborate meals. These changes were normal parts of aging, but they required adjustments in how our family functioned. I was the obvious choice to take on increased caregiving responsibilities. My own children were old enough to be relatively independent. Thomas's income was stable enough that I didn't need to work outside the home, and I lived closest to our parents' farm. More importantly, I wanted to care for them. After everything they had given me throughout my life, helping them in their later years felt like both a privilege and an obligation. I began stopping by their house every morning to help with breakfast and medication management. I took over most of the grocery shopping and heavy cleaning. I drove them to doctor's appointments and social engagements. I organized their finances and helped them understand Medicare paperwork and insurance claims. None of these tasks felt burdensome because they were expressions of love and gratitude, but Anthony viewed my increased involvement in our parents' daily lives with deep suspicion and growing hostility. During his quarterly visits home, he would interrogate me about their finances, their health status, their living arrangements, and their long-term plans. He seemed particularly concerned about who had access to their bank accounts, who was listed on their insurance policies, and who would inherit their property when they died. "It's interesting how you've managed to make yourself indispensable," he said during one particularly unpleasant conversation in 1987. "Very convenient timing taking over just when they're getting old enough to need help." His implication was clear. I was manipulating vulnerable elderly people for financial gain. The accusation was so offensive and so contrary to everything I had ever done or believed that I struggled to respond with anything approaching civility. "Anthony, I'm helping our parents because I love them and because it's the right thing to do. If you're concerned about their welfare, you're welcome to share in their care. There's certainly enough work for both of us." "Oh, I'm sure there is," he replied with a bitter laugh. "But somehow I doubt you'd welcome any interference with your little setup here." These conversations left me feeling frustrated and hurt, but they also revealed something important about Anthony's character. He seemed genuinely unable to believe that anyone could act out of pure love or selfless devotion. In his worldview, every kind gesture had an ulterior motive. Every act of service was really a form of manipulation. every expression of care was actually a calculated investment in future gain. This cynical perspective made it impossible for him to appreciate or reciprocate the love that our parents continued to offer him, despite his years of coldness and rejection. When Mama called him on his birthday to express her love and ask about his well-being, he would interpret her concern as intrusion or manipulation. When Daddy sent him money during times of financial difficulty, he would accept it as his due rather than recognizing it as a gift from someone who still hoped for reconciliation. In 1990, Mama began showing early signs of dementia. The changes were subtle. At first, she would forget where she had placed household items, repeat stories she had just told, occasionally become confused about dates or times. These episodes were infrequent and mild, but they were enough to alert me that more significant changes might be coming. I discussed the situation with Daddy, who had noticed the same concerning signs, but had been hoping they were just normal effects of aging. Together, we made the decision to consult with a geriatric specialist in Lexington, who confirmed our fears. Mama was in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. The diagnosis was devastating for all of us, but it hit Daddy particularly hard. He and Mama had been married for over 40 years, and the thought of losing her gradually piece by piece was almost more than he could bear. I watched him struggle with grief and fear while simultaneously trying to maintain his strength for her sake. As Mama's condition deteriorated over the next few years, I increased my involvement in their daily care even further. I helped Daddy understand the medications she needed, the safety precautions that had to be taken, the dietary changes that might slow the progression of her symptoms. I researched support groups and respite care services. I learned about managing the behavioral changes that accompany dementia. Most importantly, I simply spent time with them. I sat with Mama during her confused episodes, reminding her gently of where she was and who I was. I helped her with personal care tasks that became increasingly difficult for her to manage alone. I gave Daddy breaks from the constant vigilance that caring for someone with dementia requires. Anthony's response to Mama's illness was characteristically self-centered and cruel. Instead of offering support or assistance, he complained about the inconvenience of having to deal with a family member who had mental health issues. Instead of expressing sympathy for Daddy's situation, he grumbled about the expense of medical care and wondered aloud how much money was being wasted on treatments that wouldn't cure the disease. During one particularly awful visit in 1993, Anthony actually suggested that we should consider placing Mama in a nursing home because caring for her at home was becoming too expensive and time-consuming. When Daddy and I rejected this idea emphatically, Anthony accused us of being impractical and sentimental. "You're letting emotion cloud your judgment," he said with clinical detachment. "She doesn't even recognize us half the time. What's the point of bankrupting the family to keep her at home when she'd receive better professional care in an institution?" The coldness of this statement, referring to our beloved mother as if she were a broken appliance that should be disposed of, revealed the extent to which Anthony had lost his basic humanity. Daddy was so shocked and hurt by these words that he asked Anthony to leave immediately and not return until he could show proper respect for the woman who had given birth to him and loved him unconditionally. Anthony's parting words as he stormed out of the house were, "Don't come crying to me when this whole situation becomes more than you can handle. And don't expect me to help pay for the mess you're creating with your stubborn refusal to face reality." Mama died on September 18, 1994, on a quiet Sunday morning while Daddy and I sat beside her bed, holding her hands. Her passing was peaceful, without pain or struggle, as if she had simply decided it was time to rest after a life of constant service to others. Even in the fog of her illness, she had retained her essential sweetness and gentleness right up until the end. I called Anthony to inform him of Mama's death, expecting that even he would be moved by the loss of the woman who had brought him into the world and loved him through all his difficult years. His response shocked me with its casual indifference. "Well, I guess it was time," he said, as if we were discussing the weather. She hadn't really been herself for years anyway. When's the funeral? I'll need to arrange time off work. No expression of grief. No acknowledgement of what Mama had meant to our family. No sympathy for Daddy's devastation or my own sorrow. Just practical questions about scheduling, as if our mother's death were simply another item to be managed on his calendar. Anthony arrived at the funeral home the evening before the service, accompanied by his wife, a pinched, unpleasant woman named Janet, whom none of us had ever warmed to, and their 2 teenage children who seemed as uncomfortable and resentful as their parents. He went through the motions of viewing Mama's body and accepting condolences from community members, but there was something performative about his grief, as if he were playing a role rather than experiencing genuine emotion. More disturbing was his behavior during the reception after the funeral. While the rest of us were still processing our loss and comforting one another, Anthony was asking questions about Mama's personal belongings, her jewelry, her savings account, and what would happen to her portion of the family's assets. These inquiries, made within hours of our mother's burial, struck everyone who heard them as grotesquely inappropriate. "Don't you think it's a little early to be talking about money?" Peter asked him bluntly. "We just put Mama in the ground this morning." "Death doesn't stop the world from turning," Anthony replied with chilling pragmatism. "These things need to be discussed while everyone's together. We can't just pretend practical matters don't exist because we're sad." 3 days after the funeral, Anthony appeared at Daddy's house with a manila folder full of legal documents and a calculator. He hadn't come to check on Daddy's emotional well-being or to offer comfort during this difficult time. He had come to discuss the division of Mama's estate. The scene that followed was one of the most painful experiences of my entire life. Daddy was still in the acute phase of grief, barely able to get dressed in the morning or eat regular meals. He would spend hours sitting in Mama's favorite chair, holding pieces of her clothing and crying silently. The last thing he needed was to be confronted with legal paperwork and financial calculations, but Anthony was relentless. He spread documents across the kitchen table and began explaining Kentucky inheritance law as if he were conducting a business meeting. He had researched community property statutes, calculated the current value of the family farm, and prepared detailed spreadsheets showing how Mama's share of their joint assets should be divided among her children. "Now I know this is difficult to think about right now," he said in a tone that suggested he didn't find it difficult at all. "But we need to establish clearly what Mom was entitled to and how that should be distributed. Under Kentucky law, she owned 50% of all marital property, and now that 50% passes to her heirs." Daddy looked at the papers with confusion and distress. He had never thought about his life with Mama in terms of percentages and legal ownership. To him, everything they had built together belonged to both of them equally, and now that she was gone, he assumed he would continue living as he always had until his own death. "I don't understand what you're saying, son," Daddy said, his voice weak with exhaustion and sorrow. "Your mother never owned half of anything separate from me. We shared everything. We built everything together." "That's not how the law works, Dad," Anthony replied impatiently. "Emotionally, you might have shared everything, but legally Mom had specific rights and interests. And now those rights and interests belong to her children." I sat there listening to this conversation with growing horror. Anthony was essentially arguing that Daddy was no longer entitled to live peacefully in his own home, that the farm he had worked for 50 years was now partially owned by his children, that decisions about his future living arrangements should be made collectively, rather than by him alone. The cruelty of this position was breathtaking. Here was a man who had just lost his life partner, who was struggling with the most profound grief a human being can experience, being told that his own son was going to challenge his right to remain in his own home. When I tried to object to Anthony's interpretation of the situation, he turned on me with accusations that revealed the true depth of his paranoia and suspicion. "Of course you're opposed to this, Fela. You've been positioning yourself as Dad's primary caregiver for years. You've got access to all his financial information. You're involved in every decision he makes. You've isolated him from the rest of the family. Now you want to make sure that when he dies, you'll be the primary beneficiary of everything Mom and Dad worked for. These accusations were so outrageous, so completely contrary to my actual motivations and behavior, that I was momentarily speechless. I had cared for our parents out of love, not calculation. I had never asked for anything in return, had never expected special treatment, had never even thought about inheritance or financial gain. But Anthony's conspiracy theory had taken root in his mind and was growing like a cancer. In his distorted worldview, every act of kindness I had shown our parents was evidence of manipulation. Every hour I had spent caring for Mama during her illness was proof of ulterior motives. Every sacrifice I had made for their comfort and well-being was actually an investment in my own future financial security. The worst part was that I could see these accusations were beginning to affect Daddy. In his grief-stricken and vulnerable state, he was starting to wonder if there might be some truth to Anthony's claims. The doubt in his eyes was like a knife in my heart. What followed was 2 years of legal warfare that nearly destroyed what remained of our family. Anthony hired a lawyer, a sharp-dressed man from Lexington named Robert Hayes, who specialized in inheritance disputes and filed a formal petition to have Mama's estate appraised and divided according to state law. The legal process was complicated, expensive, and emotionally devastating. Every aspect of our parents' life together had to be examined, valued, and categorized. Their modest home, their small savings account, Mama's few pieces of jewelry, even her personal belongings had to be appraised by professional evaluators. Meanwhile, Anthony launched a campaign to turn my other siblings against me. He called John and Peter regularly, filling their heads with theories about my supposed manipulation of our parents. He suggested that I had been stealing money from Daddy's accounts, influencing his decisions for my own benefit, and positioning myself to inherit more than my fair share when he died. John, who had always been somewhat easily influenced, began to express doubts about my motives. During one particularly painful conversation, he asked me directly whether I had been taking advantage of our parents' trust. Fella, I don't want to believe what Anthony is saying, but he seems so certain about everything, and he's shown me bank statements that look suspicious. Can you explain some of these transactions? The bank statements Anthony had shown John were legitimate, but they were being interpreted in the most negative possible light. Every withdrawal I had made to pay for groceries, medications, or household repairs was presented as evidence of theft. Every deposit I had made to supplement their income when unexpected expenses arose was portrayed as a suspicious attempt to confuse the financial records. I spent hours explaining each transaction to John, showing him receipts and documentation that proved every penny had been spent on our parents' legitimate needs. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and I could see that our relationship was permanently damaged by Anthony's campaign of suspicion. Peter remained more loyal to me, but even he began asking uncomfortable questions about why I had taken on so much responsibility for our parents' care, and whether my motives were entirely pure. The fact that my own brothers could believe I was capable of exploiting vulnerable elderly people was almost more painful than Anthony's original accusations. The legal battle dragged on for 18 months, during which time Daddy's health deteriorated rapidly. The stress of having his own children fight over his wife's estate while she was barely cold in her grave was more than his aging body and mind could handle. He developed high blood pressure, suffered from chronic insomnia, and began showing signs of depression that worried me deeply. Finally, in early 1996, Anthony's lawyer negotiated a settlement that satisfied no one but ended the immediate conflict. Mama's portion of the estate was valued at approximately $60,000, which was divided equally among her 5 children. Each of us received $12,000 minus legal fees and court costs. For this paltry sum, less than the cost of a new car, Anthony had torn our family apart, subjected our grieving father to months of legal torment, and destroyed relationships that had taken decades to build. The money he received didn't even cover the legal fees he had incurred pursuing the case. But the financial settlement was only the beginning of the damage. Anthony's victory in court seemed to convince him that his suspicions about me were justified and that his interpretation of family dynamics was correct. Instead of being satisfied with the outcome, he became more paranoid and accusatory. He began spreading rumors throughout our small town that I had been financially abusing our parents for years. He told anyone who would listen that the legal settlement had exposed my true nature, and that I had only agreed to the division because I was afraid of what might be discovered if the case went to trial. These stories spread through Triumph's social networks with the speed and destructiveness of wildfire. Suddenly, neighbors who had known me since childhood were looking at me with suspicion and distrust. Shopkeepers who had always been friendly became cool and professional. Friends from church began avoiding me during social gatherings. The reputation I had spent 43 years building in our community was being destroyed by lies and half-truths spread by my own brother. The irony wasn't lost on me. Anthony, who had spent decades bad-mouthing our hometown and expressing contempt for its residents, was now using those same residents as weapons against me. Daddy never fully recovered from the trauma of the legal battle over Mama's estate. The man who had once been strong enough to work 16-hour days now seemed fragile and defeated. He had always believed that families should support each other through difficult times, and the spectacle of his own children fighting over money while he grieved his wife's death had shattered something fundamental in his worldview. "I don't understand what happened to my family," he would say during our quiet conversations in the evening. "When did money become more important than love? When did my children start seeing each other as enemies instead of allies?" I tried to comfort him, to assure him that not all of his children had lost their way, but I could see that the damage was too deep to heal completely. He had lost faith not just in Anthony, but in the fundamental goodness of family relationships. The trust and security that had defined his entire adult life had been shattered by his eldest son's greed and paranoia. In the years following Mama's death, I continued caring for Daddy as his health gradually declined. He developed diabetes, which required careful management of his diet and medication. His arthritis worsened, making it difficult for him to perform basic tasks like cooking and cleaning. His eyesight deteriorated, forcing him to give up reading, which had been one of his greatest pleasures. Through all of these changes, I remained committed to helping him maintain his independence and dignity. I visited him daily, prepared his meals, managed his medications, drove him to medical appointments, and handled his financial affairs. Not because I expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do, and because I genuinely enjoyed his company. Daddy was a wise man with a lifetime of experience and stories. Even in his declining years, conversations with him were enlightening and comforting. He had a perspective on life that came from surviving the Great Depression, World War II, and decades of hard work and simple living. His advice was always practical and compassionate, his humor gentle and self-deprecating. But Anthony continued to view my caregiving role with suspicion and hostility. During his infrequent visits, he would interrogate Daddy about his finances, his living arrangements, and his plans for the future. He would ask leading questions designed to uncover evidence that I was manipulating or taking advantage of the situation. Dad, are you sure you understand all the financial decisions Fela is making for you? Do you actually review the bank statements yourself, or do you just trust her to handle everything? These questions were clearly intended to plant seeds of doubt about my trustworthiness, and I could see that they made Daddy uncomfortable and defensive. He would assure Anthony that he was fully aware of his financial situation and completely confident in my integrity, but the fact that he had to provide such assurances was hurtful to both of us. In 2003, when Daddy was 81 years old, he suffered a mild stroke that left him with some weakness on his left side and occasional confusion about dates and recent events. The stroke wasn't life-threatening, but it was a clear indication that his independence was becoming more limited and that he would need increased assistance with daily activities. After extensive discussions with his doctors and careful consideration of all available options, Daddy and I decided that he should move into my home where I could provide round-the-clock care while still allowing him to maintain as much autonomy as possible. Thomas and I converted our guest bedroom into a comfortable living space for him, installed safety equipment in the bathroom, and arranged for visiting nurses to help with medical care. The transition was remarkably smooth. Daddy seemed relieved to be surrounded by family activity, rather than living alone in his increasingly empty house. He enjoyed spending time with my daughters, now grown women with families of their own, and he found purpose in helping with small tasks around the house and yard. But Anthony was furious about this arrangement. He accused me of manipulating Daddy into leaving his own home so that I could gain complete control over his life and finances. He claimed that living with me would isolate Daddy from the rest of the family and make him even more dependent on my assistance. Very convenient timing, he said during a heated telephone conversation. Right when Dad is starting to get confused and vulnerable, you swoop in and convince him to move into your house. Now you'll have complete access to everything he owns, and none of the rest of us will even know what's happening to him. These accusations were particularly painful because they ignored the obvious reality of the situation. Daddy needed increased care, and I was the only family member willing and able to provide it. Anthony lived 3 hours away, had never shown any interest in caregiving responsibilities, and had made it clear that he viewed our father primarily as a financial asset rather than a human being deserving of love and respect. If Anthony had been genuinely concerned about Daddy's welfare, he could have offered to share in his care, visited more frequently, or suggested alternative arrangements that would better serve Daddy's needs. Instead, he chose to attack the one person who was actually making sacrifices to ensure our father's comfort and safety. For the next 5 years, from 2003 to 2008, Daddy lived peacefully in my home, surrounded by the love and attention he deserved. His health was stable, his spirits were generally good, and he seemed content with the arrangement we had created. He participated in family dinners, attended church services when he felt up to it, and maintained friendships with neighbors and community members who came to visit him regularly. During this period, I learned things about caregiving that no book or class could have taught me. I discovered the patience required to help someone dress when their hands shake too much to manage buttons. I learned how to encourage appetite when medications affect taste and digestion. I mastered the delicate balance between providing necessary assistance and preserving personal dignity. Most importantly, I experienced the profound privilege of spending concentrated time with someone whose wisdom and life experience were invaluable. Daddy and I had conversations during those years that I treasure to this day. He told me stories about his childhood that I had never heard before, shared his thoughts about marriage and parenting, and offered insights about life that only come from 8 decades of careful observation. Anthony visited perhaps 4 times during those 5 years, and each visit was marked by the same pattern of suspicious questioning and barely concealed hostility. He would arrive unannounced, spend an hour or two interrogating Daddy about his living situation and finances, make several disparaging comments about the care he was receiving, and then leave without offering any practical assistance or emotional support. During one particularly unpleasant visit in 2006, Anthony brought a tape recorder and attempted to conduct what he called a formal interview with Daddy about his mental competency and decision-making capacity. The implication was clear. He was gathering evidence that could be used later to challenge Daddy's mental fitness or to question decisions he had made while living in my care. Daddy was deeply offended by this interrogation. What kind of son treats his father like a suspect in a criminal investigation? He asked me after Anthony had left. What did I do wrong in raising that boy, that he could become so cold and calculating? I had no answer for him. The Anthony who had emerged in adulthood bore so little resemblance to the child Daddy remembered that it was as if they were discussing 2 different people. The transformation was so complete and so devastating that even Anthony's own father could no longer recognize him as the son he had raised with love and hope. In early 2008, Daddy's health began to decline more rapidly. He developed congestive heart failure, which caused fatigue, shortness of breath, and swelling in his legs and feet. His doctors adjusted his medications and recommended lifestyle changes, but it was clear that his body was beginning to wear out after 86 years of hard use. I increased my caregiving efforts accordingly, monitoring his symptoms more closely, helping him with mobility and personal care, and ensuring that he was as comfortable as possible during what we all understood might be his final months. The visiting nurses came more frequently, and we discussed end-of-life care options to make sure his wishes would be respected. Daddy faced his declining health with the same quiet dignity he had brought to every other challenge in his life. He didn't complain about pain or limitations, didn't express fear about death, and didn't demand attention or sympathy. He simply accepted what was happening to him and tried to make the best of each day he had left. But he did have one major concern that weighed heavily on his mind: the state of his relationship with Anthony and the likelihood that his death would precipitate another family conflict over inheritance. He had witnessed firsthand how Mama's death had been used as an excuse for legal warfare and character assassination, and he was determined to prevent a similar situation from developing. In August 2008, Daddy asked me to drive him to the office of Walter Morrison, the lawyer who had handled his and Mama's affairs for decades. He wanted to update his will to make his intentions crystal clear and to minimize the possibility that his estate could become a source of family discord. The will Daddy created was a model of fairness and clarity. He divided his assets equally among his surviving children, with specific instructions about how various properties and possessions should be distributed. He appointed me as executor of his estate, not because he wanted to give me additional privileges, but because I was the child who had shown the most responsibility and trustworthiness in handling financial and legal matters. Most importantly, he included a detailed letter explaining his decisions and expressing his love for all of his children, despite the pain some of them had caused him. He specifically acknowledged the care I had provided during his final years, but he made it clear that this care did not entitle me to any special financial benefits beyond what was fair and equitable. I want to make sure no one can claim I was confused or manipulated when I made these decisions, he told Mr. Morrison during our visit. My mind is clear, my intentions are fair, and my love for my children is unconditional, even when their behavior toward me has been disappointing. Daddy died on March 15, 2009, on a Sunday evening, while I sat beside his bed, reading him passages from the Bible. His passing was peaceful and dignified, exactly as he would have wanted it. He simply closed his eyes during a prayer and slipped away without struggle or distress, leaving behind a legacy of love, hard work, and unwavering integrity. I called Anthony to inform him of Daddy's death, just as I had called him when Mama died 15 years earlier. His response was even more callous and disturbing than before. "Well, I guess that's that," he said with shocking indifference. "When's the funeral? I'll need to make arrangements with work. And Fela, I hope you understand that we're going to need to settle his estate quickly and fairly. I won't tolerate any of the games you played when Mom died." Games? I had never played games with anyone's estate. I had simply tried to protect our grieving father from Anthony's premature and inappropriate financial demands. But clearly, Anthony had rewritten history in his mind to cast himself as the victim and me as the manipulator in every family conflict. The funeral arrangements proceeded smoothly with input from all of Daddy's children about the service, the burial, and the reception afterward. Despite his faults, Anthony did contribute to the planning process and helped cover the costs involved. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that our shared grief might restore some sense of family unity and common purpose. That hope was shattered on the day of the funeral itself. The service was held at Triumph Community Church, where Daddy had been a member for over 60 years. The sanctuary was filled with friends, neighbors, and community members who had known and respected him throughout his long life. Pastor Williams delivered a beautiful eulogy that captured Daddy's character and contributions to our town. Everything was proceeding with the dignity and reverence that Daddy deserved until Anthony arrived at the church with an entourage that shocked everyone present. In addition to his wife and children, he brought 3 men in expensive suits whom none of us recognized. They positioned themselves strategically around the sanctuary, taking photographs and making notes as if they were investigators gathering evidence. During the eulogy, one of these men approached me and handed me a business card, identifying him as a private investigator specializing in estate fraud. He whispered that he would need to speak with me after the service about irregularities in my father's financial records and living arrangements during his final years. I was so shocked by this development that I could barely focus on the remainder of the service. Anthony had actually hired professional investigators to build a case against me based on his paranoid theories about my caregiving role. He was treating our father's funeral as the opening move in a legal battle rather than as a final tribute to a man who deserved respect and peace. But the worst was yet to come. After the burial, as family and friends gathered in the church fellowship hall for the traditional meal, Anthony stood up and asked for everyone's attention. I assumed he wanted to thank people for coming or to share a memory about Daddy. Instead, he launched into a prepared speech that was clearly designed to destroy my reputation and justify the legal action he was planning. "Before we go any further," he announced in a loud, carrying voice, "I think everyone here should know the truth about what happened to my father during his final years. The truth about how he was isolated, manipulated, and financially exploited by someone he trusted completely." The room fell silent with shock and discomfort. People looked around at each other with confusion and embarrassment, unsure whether they should leave or stay to hear what Anthony was about to say. My sister Fela convinced my father to move into her house so she could gain complete control over his finances and his decision-making. She isolated him from the rest of his family, managed all of his money without oversight, and positioned herself to inherit the majority of his estate. These accusations, delivered in front of 200 people who had known me since childhood, were like physical blows. I stood there frozen with humiliation and disbelief as Anthony continued his character assassination. "I have hired investigators who have uncovered evidence of financial irregularities, questionable medical decisions, and deliberate isolation of a vulnerable elderly man. I want everyone here to know that I will be contesting my father's will and seeking justice for the abuse he suffered during his final years." At that point, I found my voice and tried to defend myself, but Anthony was not finished. "You killed him, Fela," he shouted, his voice rising to a level that could be heard throughout the building. "You killed our father with your greed and manipulation. He died broken-hearted because he finally realized what kind of daughter he had raised." The silence that followed this declaration was deafening. I looked around the room at faces I had known for decades, neighbors, church members, family friends, and saw confusion, shock, and in some cases, the beginning of doubt about my character and motivations. Pastor Williams tried to restore order and dignity to the gathering, asking Anthony to respect the solemnity of the occasion and to address family disputes privately rather than publicly. But the damage was done. Anthony had succeeded in planting seeds of suspicion about me in the minds of everyone present. As people began to leave the reception, many of them avoided eye contact with me or offered only perfunctory condolences. The warmth and support I had expected from my community during this difficult time had been replaced by uncertainty and distrust, all because of Anthony's calculated assault on my reputation. That night, alone in my house for the first time in years, I wept, not just for the loss of my father, but for the destruction of my family and my place in the community I had called home for over 50 years. Anthony had achieved what he set out to do. He had turned me into a pariah and justified his upcoming legal challenge to Daddy's will. The legal battle that followed was even more vicious and destructive than the one that had followed Mama's death. Anthony's lawyer, backed by the private investigators, filed a comprehensive challenge to Daddy's will based on claims of undue influence, financial exploitation, and mental incompetency. They alleged that I had isolated Daddy from his other children, manipulated him into changing his estate plans, and stolen money from his accounts during the years he lived in my home. They presented a detailed financial analysis that portrayed every legitimate expense as evidence of theft and every act of care as proof of manipulation. The case consumed 2 years of my life and cost me tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Every aspect of my relationship with Daddy was scrutinized, questioned, and reinterpreted in the most negative possible light. Bank records, medical records, and personal correspondence were all subpoenaed and examined for evidence of wrongdoing. The emotional toll was devastating. I had to relive every moment of Daddy's decline and death. But now, those memories were filtered through the lens of Anthony's accusations. Instead of being able to grieve naturally and find comfort in the knowledge that I had provided loving care, during his final years, I was forced to defend my every action and decision. The investigation revealed no evidence of financial impropriety or abuse. In fact, the records showed that I had spent thousands of dollars of my own money supplementing Daddy's care, purchasing medical equipment and covering expenses that his limited income couldn't handle. Far from exploiting him financially, I had made significant personal sacrifices to ensure his comfort and well-being. But Anthony was not satisfied with these findings. He continued to insist that there was a conspiracy to hide evidence of my wrongdoing, that the investigators hadn't looked hard enough, that there were assets and transactions that hadn't been discovered. His paranoia had reached the point where no amount of evidence could convince him that his theories were wrong. In his mind, the absence of proof was itself proof of how sophisticated my alleged crimes had been. In March 2011, exactly 2 years after Daddy's death, the court ruled definitively in my favor. The judge found no evidence of undue influence, financial exploitation, or mental incompetency. Daddy's will was validated in its entirety, and his estate was distributed exactly as he had intended. More importantly, the judge issued a strongly worded rebuke to Anthony and his legal team for pursuing what he called a frivolous and malicious lawsuit based on unfounded suspicions and financial self-interest rather than legitimate concerns about elder abuse. The judge's ruling included a detailed letter that Daddy had written explaining his estate decisions, expressing his gratitude for my care during his final years, and specifically stating that his mental faculties were clear and that his decisions were made without any external pressure or influence. My daughter Ophelia has sacrificed years of her own life to ensure my comfort and dignity during my declining health, Daddy had written. She has asked for nothing in return and has given everything she could. While I am dividing my estate equally among all my children, I want it clearly understood that Ophelia's inheritance is not a reward for her care. It is simply her fair share of what her mother and I built together. Her care was a gift of love that cannot be repaid with money. Reading those words in court, surrounded by lawyers and investigators and court reporters, I finally understood the full extent of what Anthony had cost our family. He had turned the final loving gesture of a grateful father into evidence for a criminal conspiracy. He had transformed years of selfless caregiving into a calculated financial scheme. He had poisoned every memory of Daddy's final years with suspicion and legal proceedings. But most tragically, he had ensured that I would never be able to remember caring for our father without also remembering the pain of being accused of exploiting him. Anthony had stolen not just money or property, but something far more precious, the peace and dignity that should have surrounded our father's death, and the loving memories that should have comforted his survivors. In the aftermath of the court victory, I learned things about Anthony that finally explained his decades of resentment and paranoia. During the legal proceedings, evidence had emerged about his personal financial situation that cast his inheritance obsession in a new light. Anthony had accumulated massive gambling debts over the years, losses that had spiraled far beyond his ability to repay. He owed money to casinos' private creditors and loan sharks who were becoming increasingly aggressive in their collection efforts. His house was mortgaged to the limit, his credit cards were maxed out, and his marriage was falling apart under the financial pressure. The inheritance he had been so desperate to claim wasn't just about greed, it was about survival. He had been counting on Daddy's estate to solve his financial problems and save him from the consequences of his own poor decisions. When it became clear that the estate would be divided equally among all the children, providing him with only a modest inheritance, he had convinced himself that I must be stealing his rightful share. This revelation didn't excuse his behavior, but it did make it more understandable. Anthony hadn't been motivated purely by evil intentions. He had been driven by desperation and the kind of magical thinking that comes when someone is drowning in problems of their own making. But understanding his motivations didn't heal the damage he had caused. Our family was irretrievably broken. John and Peter, who had been caught in the middle of the legal battle, were exhausted by years of conflict and wanted nothing more to do with family disputes. They maintained polite relationships with both Anthony and me, but the easy closeness we had once shared was gone forever. Anthony himself disappeared from our lives completely after the court ruling. He moved away from Kentucky, cut off contact with all his siblings, and made no attempt to repair the relationships he had destroyed. The last I heard, he was living in Florida under financial supervision from his creditors, having lost his house, his business, and his marriage to his gambling addiction. Sometimes, I wonder if he ever thinks about what he threw away in his obsession with money that didn't even exist. Does he remember the family that once loved him unconditionally? Does he regret the years of bitterness and paranoia that consumed his life and destroyed his relationships? Or has he convinced himself, even now, that he was the victim of some elaborate conspiracy, that his family conspired against him, that he was right to fight for what he believed was his? I will probably never know the answers to these questions. Anthony has become a stranger to me, someone whose name I share, but whose heart and mind I no longer recognize. The brother I once loved is gone, replaced by someone whose capacity for suspicion and cruelty I never could have imagined. Today, as I sit here at 71 years old, telling this story for the first time to an audience beyond my immediate family, I find myself reflecting on the lessons I've learned from this long and painful experience. I've learned that family relationships, no matter how strong they seem, can be destroyed by forces beyond our control. I've learned that love, no matter how pure or consistent, cannot always overcome resentment, suspicion, and self-destructive behavior. I've learned that some people will choose to see malice and conspiracy even in the most obviously innocent actions. But I've also learned that doing the right thing is its own reward, regardless of how others interpret or respond to it. I know that I provided loving care to both of my parents during their final years. I know that their lives were better because of the sacrifices I made and the attention I gave them. I know that they died feeling loved and supported, surrounded by family who truly cared about their well-being. Anthony's accusations and legal challenges cannot change these fundamental truths. They cannot transform acts of love into acts of exploitation. They cannot rewrite history or alter the reality of what actually happened during those precious final years with my parents. I have also learned the importance of community and the danger of allowing toxic family members to poison other relationships. After the court case ended, I worked hard to rebuild my reputation in triumph and to reconnect with friends and neighbors who had been confused by Anthony's accusations. Most people, once they learned the facts of the situation, understood that I had been the victim of unfair attacks rather than the perpetrator of any wrongdoing. But the experience taught me that reputation is fragile and that lies once spoken can never be completely unspoken. Some people in our community will always remember the accusations more clearly than the vindication. Some will always wonder if there might have been some truth to Anthony's claims, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of what Anthony did. He not only attacked me personally, but he damaged my standing in the community where I had lived my entire life. He weaponized the natural human tendency to believe that where there's smoke, there must be fire, using people's trust and openness against both them and me. In the years since the legal battle ended, I have focused on rebuilding and strengthening the relationships that matter most to me. My daughters and their families have been sources of tremendous comfort and support. My grandchildren bring joy and purpose to my daily life. My true friends have stood by me through the difficulties and continue to enrich my world with their presence and wisdom. I have also found meaning in sharing my story with others who have faced similar challenges in their own families. Unfortunately, what happened to my family is not unique. Many people struggle with relatives who cannot accept love without suspicion, who view every act of kindness as manipulation, who allow greed or desperation to destroy the bonds that should provide comfort and security throughout life. To those people, I want to say this: you are not responsible for healing someone who is determined to remain broken. You are not obligated to continue subjecting yourself to abuse in the name of family loyalty. You cannot love someone out of their dysfunction if they are not willing to acknowledge and address their problems. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to set boundaries and protect yourself from those who would use your love as a weapon against you. Sometimes the healthiest choice is to accept that a relationship cannot be salvaged and to focus your energy on those who appreciate and reciprocate your care. This doesn't mean giving up on people easily or abandoning family members at the first sign of difficulty. It means recognizing the difference between someone who is struggling and needs patience and support, and someone who is actively choosing to cause harm and destruction. Anthony fell into the second category. Despite decades of love, patience, and attempts at reconciliation from his family, he chose resentment over gratitude, suspicion over trust, and destruction over healing. Those were his choices, not ours, and we cannot be held responsible for the consequences of decisions we didn't make. As I conclude this long and difficult story, I want to return to the scene that began it that terrible day at Daddy's funeral, when Anthony screamed his accusations across our father's coffin, destroying any remaining possibility of family unity or peace. In the moment when he said those words, "You killed him, Fela. You killed our father with your greed," I felt as if my own heart was being torn from my chest. Not just because of the cruelty of the accusation, but because of what it represented: the final death of any hope that my brother might someday return to the family that had never stopped loving him. Standing there in that church, surrounded by the shocked faces of people who had known me since childhood, I realized that Anthony was no longer the brother I had grown up with, played with, shared secrets with, and worried about for decades. He had become someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of cruelty I never could have imagined. But I also realized something else in that moment. I was not going to allow his accusations to define me or to destroy the peace I had found in knowing that I had done everything I could for our parents. I was not going to let his twisted interpretation of my actions change my understanding of what had actually happened during those final years with Mama and Daddy. I had loved them, cared for them, sacrificed for them, and been present with them during their most vulnerable times. Those actions were pure and good, regardless of how Anthony chose to interpret them. His inability to recognize love when he saw it was his limitation, not my failure. In the 5 years since Daddy's death, I have found peace in this understanding. I sleep well at night knowing that my parents died, feeling loved and cared for. I take comfort in the memories of quiet conversations, shared meals, and simple moments of connection that marked our time together during their final years. Anthony cannot take those memories from me, no matter how many lawyers he hires or how many accusations he makes. He cannot rewrite the history of what actually happened or transform acts of love into acts of exploitation. The truth exists independent of his interpretation of it, and that truth is what sustains me. I also take comfort in knowing that Mama and Daddy understood the reality of our family dynamics long before they died. They knew which of their children could be trusted with their care and which could not. They knew who was motivated by love and who was motivated by self-interest. Their decisions about how to handle their final years and their estates reflected this understanding. The fact that Anthony was not chosen to serve as their primary caregiver or executor of their estates was not evidence of favoritism or manipulation. It was evidence of their clear-eyed assessment of their children's characters and capabilities. They entrusted these responsibilities to me, not because I was their favorite, but because I had proven myself worthy of their trust through years of consistent, selfless behavior. This knowledge helps me deal with the lingering sadness I feel about the loss of my relationship with Anthony. I grieve not for the person he became, but for the person he could have been if he had made different choices. I mourn the loss of the family unity that defined our childhood and the security that comes from knowing your siblings will be there for each other through life's challenges. But I do not regret the actions I took or the choices I made during our parents' final years. Given the same circumstances, I would make the same decisions again. Caring for them was not a burden or a sacrifice. It was a privilege and an honor that I will treasure for the rest of my life. To anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation, caring for aging parents while dealing with family members who question your motives or challenge your decisions, I want to offer this advice. Trust your heart, document your actions, and don't let others' suspicions poison your own understanding of your motivations. If you are providing care out of love, that love will be evident in how you treat the person you're caring for. It will show in the patience you demonstrate during difficult moments, the attention you pay to their comfort and dignity, the way you advocate for their needs and respect their wishes. Those who are motivated by greed or self-interest reveal themselves through their impatience, their focus on financial rather than personal concerns, their willingness to compromise care in order to save money or effort. The difference is usually obvious to anyone who is paying attention with an open mind. Don't let the Anthonys of the world convince you that your love is really manipulation, that your care is really self-interest, that your sacrifices are really investments. Trust your own heart and your own knowledge of why you do what you do. And so, my dear friends, we come to the end of this long and painful story. It is not the story I would have chosen to tell, but it is the story that needed to be told. It is a story about the power of love to sustain us through difficulty, and about the power of resentment to destroy even the strongest family bonds. It is a story about the choices we make and the consequences of those choices, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. It is a story about the importance of gratitude, the danger of greed, and the necessity of accepting people as they are, rather than as we wish they could be. Most importantly, it is a story about finding peace in the knowledge that we have done our best with the circumstances we were given. We cannot control how others interpret our actions or respond to our love, but we can control how we choose to live our own lives. I have chosen to live with love service and gratitude rather than with resentment, suspicion, and bitterness. I have chosen to focus on the relationships that bring joy and meaning to my life, rather than dwelling on the ones that have been lost to dysfunction and cruelty. These choices have not always been easy, but they have been consistent with my values and my understanding of what makes life worth living. They have allowed me to find happiness and purpose, even in the midst of family tragedy and personal attack. As I look toward the future, I see more opportunities to love and serve, more chances to make a positive difference in the lives of people who matter to me. I see grandchildren who will benefit from the wisdom I've gained through suffering, friends who will be supported by the strength I've developed through adversity, and a community that will be enriched by the lessons I've learned about resilience and forgiveness. Anthony will always be my brother, and I will always love the memory of the child he once was. But I have accepted that the man he became is not someone I can have a relationship with, and I have found peace in that acceptance. I wish him well wherever he is, and whatever challenges he may be facing. I hope that someday he will find the peace and contentment that eluded him for so many years. I hope that he will discover the joy that comes from giving rather than taking, from trusting rather than suspecting, from loving rather than resenting. But I will not spend the rest of my life waiting for that transformation or allowing his choices to continue affecting my happiness. I have too much to be grateful for, too many people to love, and too little time remaining to waste any of it on regret or bitterness. That perhaps is the most important lesson I can offer from this difficult story. Life is too precious and too brief to spend it dwelling on relationships that cannot be healed or circumstances that cannot be changed. We must focus our energy on what we can control and find our joy in what we can influence. For me, that means continuing to be the kind of daughter, sister, mother, and grandmother that my parents raised me to be. It means honoring their memory through my actions rather than letting their legacy be tainted by the family conflicts that surrounded their deaths. It means living with the confidence that comes from knowing I did everything I could with the love and resources I had available. And it means facing whatever challenges lie ahead with the wisdom gained from surviving the challenges I have already overcome. This is my story told with honesty and hope, offered with the prayer that it might help someone else who is facing similar struggles in their own family. We are not alone in these difficulties, and we do not have to face them without the support and understanding of others who have walked similar paths. May we all find the strength to love generously, the wisdom to set appropriate boundaries, and the peace that comes from knowing we have lived according to our highest values, regardless of how others have chosen to live according to theirs. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about an old woman's memories and an old family's sorrows. And thank you for the reminder that even the most painful experiences can become sources of wisdom and strength when shared with compassionate hearts. God bless you all, and may your own families be blessed with the love, understanding, and unity that every family deserves, but not every family achieves. May you cherish what you have while you have it, and may you find peace in whatever challenges life brings your way.